name Robin Hood conjures up an image of a man darting through the forest, an outlaw who takes from the rich to give to the poor. This concept has been cemented into our minds by the world of film and television, where actor after actor has portrayed the hooded hero. The purpose of this documentary is to explore as best we can the origins and endurance of the myth and Robin Hood's changing significance over time, with particular focus on the historiographical debate that surround it.
While today the most familiar depictions of Robin Hood is through the medium of television and film, the earliest records, from the late medieval period, are passed on through the form of songs and tales. Debates rage around the precise dating of the ballads, and especially regarding the inspiration. Are they songs based on real outlaw, or did they originate with local mythological figure? The oldest known copies date to the 15th century. However, from literary evidence we know that the ballads exist before this time. It is worth noting that the unrecorded early Robin Hood plays and games would have been community activities used to raise money for the parish and activities to build communal bonds.
Ultimately, these sources place the existence of the outlaw around the 1290s, during the reign of Edward I. However, the chronicle and archival data may be used by historians as proof of the outlaw's existence. This is far from conclusive. The evidence cited by chroniclers is often given as common fame, that is popular opinion. Archival data, such as surname data, is more compelling for dating purposes, if only because it would be unusual linguistically for surnames such as Robin Hood, as recorded in the Sussex Subsidy Rolls in 1296, to evolve on its own, and would be influenced by public consciousness.
We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming to bring you this special news bulletin. Over to Lauren and Annie in the studio.
I'm Annabelle Dullage.
I'm Lauren Sykes.
And welcome to our special news broadcast on the historiography of Robin Hood. In 1958, R.H. Hilton renewed interest in the hooded hero, presenting Robin Hood as a hero with origins in peasant dissatisfaction during the medieval period. Hilton positions the ballads into the unstable post-Black Death England.
J.C. Holt and M. Keane became involved in the debate when Holt's article in 1960 countered Hilton's argument and said that the ballads were aimed at the lower gentry. He argues that the title of Yeoman is given to the retainers of the Lord's retinue.
However, Keane supported Hilton's argument, didn't he? When in 1961 he argued that Robin Hood was a symbol of freedom and of fight against corruption by those in power. In addition, recent scholarship has focused on the significance of the use of the word yeoman and in the original ballads.
There is some suggestion that the 15th century meaning of the word yeoman was as a farmer, which is higher than a peasant but lower than the gentry. Hilton was dismissive of any attempt to identify the word yeoman with a new social group that was emerging after the Black Death. However, there is recent work that agrees that the middling sort did emerge around this time.
Dodson and Taylor argue that, don't they? When they state Robin Hood as a hero of this new middling sort group. They personify the non-gentry classes with aspirations of the lower classes, and he ascends to his class to stand alongside kings and gentry, returning to give back to the lower classes. The classic example of taking from the rich to give to the poor.
Now for a brief message from our sponsor.
Are you a member of the lower classes? Have you been subject to rents by your local lords? Have no fear, Robin Hood is here to help you move beyond your boundaries. Call 0800 Yeoman today.
Welcome back. There are varying descriptions of what yeomanry might mean, but careful examination of original texts show Robin Hood as one type of yeoman and no other. Robin the Forester. For example, in the fourth fit of the jest, Robin is described as the yeoman of the forest, and this is repeated throughout.
This concludes our breaking news segment. Back to Tegan in the studio.
Thank you, that was really interesting. This concludes our breaking historiographical news. We now return to your regular scheduled programme. Thank you and good night.
The late medieval yeoman had a lot of responsibility. The distinction between different types of yeomen is explicit. The husbandman ploughs the field and the forester walks through the woods. Robin is presented as the self-proclaimed self-governor of the forest. He is described as knowing the land and having a band of merry men. Robin Hood is traditionally described as being dressed in forester's green, often in tights or leggings, carrying a longbow. In some early depictions, Robin's behaviour is much more violent than a later audience would be familiar with. In the original ballad, Guy of Gisborne, for example, he is shown cutting off the head of his traditional enemy, Guy of Gisborne, and sticking it on his bow. There are further beheadings in other medieval Robin Hood tales, reflecting the time in which they were made. Art imitates life. The historian Maurice Keene goes as far to say Robin was a full-blooded medieval brigand. The people that Robin targets are traditionally bishops and these archbishops, not squires and knights, the common figures of medieval corruption. Is not truly indicative of a revolutionary feeling among the lower classes seeking to overthrow the traditional hierarchy, but is rather indicative of the corruption of the time. In many medieval tales, ecclesiastical figures were the main embodiments of such corruption. In Knight's words,
the guest advocates massive theft from the church, civic insurrection against and murder of all properly appointed sheriffs, breach of legitimate agreement with a king, and it imagines that all these things can lead to a lengthy and happy life.
Robin's oldest incarnation is as Yeoman of the Forest, but is far from his only one. He made the transition from yeoman to lord in depictions during the 16th century. The significant move that changes the context of Robin Hood and his relationship with the audience. He is no longer the people's champion, a symbol of social mobility and aspiration. Instead, he is a noble rebel, perhaps a connection drawn from the real historical figure, Fulk-Fitzwarren. The outlaw memory suddenly develops a new version, the most influential examples of which were written by Anthony Munday in two plays, The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, and The Death of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, written and performed in the region of 1597 to 1601. These changed forever the way that Robin Hood was depicted. No longer an example of what Eric Hobsbawm called the social bandit, but rather a social rebel, an aristocrat who fought for the people. It is at this time that Robin Hood is placed in a specific historical context and gains the backstory that we are familiar with today. The period of the reign of Prince John, when Richard the Lionheart was away on crusade. It is significant that this change occurs during the reign of Queen Elizabeth and following the religious and political turmoil that so characterised the 1500s. In addition to this need to control the radical memory of the outlaw and the rowdiness it inspired, the Tudor myth relied on the diabolisation of bad kingship. Prince John became a proxy of Richard III, who the Tudors defeated in 1485.
However, despite this Tudor interest in the gentrification of Robin Hood, popular interest remained in the yeoman ideal of forestry and fighting. The gentrification of such a figure was, as Knight puts it, an emasculation of the tradition, and soon he would be reshaped again. During the period of industrial, political and romantic revolutions of the 18th century, Robin Hood would become the figure we would recognise in our modern tellings, somewhere between rugged yeoman and noble lord. The outlaw was reinvigorated once more by an appearance in Sir Walter Scott's 1820 classic Ivanhoe, where he was depicted as a Saxon fighting against the Norman yoke, the term given to the oppressive aspects of the feudal system, attributed to the Normans and their descendants. This idea persists for later writers, even when he is depicted as the loyal Earl of King Richard the Lionheart and brings in concepts of nationalism. However, this still was not a true combination of nobleman and forester. That was to occur in Thomas Love Peacock's 1822 novella Maid Marian, which was later adapted into a popular stage musical by J.R. Planchet that dominated the narrative of Robin Hood for the next century, and finally moulded the hooded hero into the form that we know today. The idea of Robin Hood as the Forest King, implicit in earlier material but focused by Scott, also proved popular in this time of industrialisation and increasing urbanisation. The poet John Keats wrote on Robin Hood, also in 1820, in which he claimed that, should Robin awake in the modern day,
he would swear for all his oaks, fallen beneath the dockyard strokes, have rotted on the briny seas.
Similarly, the later Georgian poets, like Alfred Noyes, wrote longingly of Sherwood in the Red Dawn, and the return of Robin Hood, Maid Marian and their band of merry men. After great success of Howard Pye's 1883 work titled The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, and continuing the trends of the last century and the early 20th century saw the expansion of Robin Hood's appearances. He remained a staple in the performing arts, a subject of plays, operas and songs, but perhaps the most adapted into film. The tale of Robin Hood is extremely suitable to young audiences. By this time, Robin's motives have been made truly heroic. His villains are truly villainous, and Robin is portrayed as a moral figure who fights injustice.
There is but one modern example which removes Robin from his original context. Rocket Robin was created in the 1960s and is indicative of the then modern obsession with space and all things futuristic.
Come gather around me, space travelers surround me, hark now to the ballad of Rocket Robin Hood. I may well confound you, astound you, spellbound you with heroes and villains, the bad and the good. Watch now as our rockets race here from afar, for now with our Robin we live on a star. 3, 2, 1, blast off!
The key characters are all there, Maid Marian, Friar Tuck and Little John, but they are all supplanted to an asteroid in the year 3000 in the new Sherwood Forest. Robin Hood is then presented as the hero fighting the truly villainous characters, but is removed from his typical and traditional medieval context for the first time. This is a bid to fuse the modern and the old and appeal to a new audience. Yet the moralistic tale remains, only with the change of context that fits in with the Cold War period in which it was made.
Modern depictions of Robin Hood largely remain consistent, rather than questioning his position as both noble and outlaw, as they might be expected to do. He is still Robin the outlaw nobleman, the man in tights with a green hat and a bow and arrow, which came about in the early part of the 20th century and into the 21st. This was largely moved around and into a more realistic representations of actual colours and materials they might have used. The first example of this in the 1990s with Kevin Costner's portrayal of Robin Hood. The colours and tones are more earthier and realistic. There is greater emphasis put on local accents, favouring medieval over modern. This trend continues up to the 21st century adaptations, including the 2006 BBC television adaptation.
In Disney's version of the story, the familiar characters of Maid Marian, Little John and Friar Tuck were all animals to attract younger audiences and to make the story more visually appealing. Robin Hood follows all the major stereotypes of the character and the familiar actions, including stealing from the rich to give to the poor.
Never ever thinking there was danger in the water they were drinking, they just guzzled it down. Never dreaming that a scheming sheriff and his posse was watching them and gathering around. Robin Hood and Little John running through the forest, jumping fences, dodging trees and trying to get away. Contemplating nothing but escape and finally making it. Oodle-lolly, golly, what a day. Oodle-lolly, golly, what a day.
The exception to this familiar storyline could be argued to be the newly feminist outlook, particularly with satirical representation, such as the 1981 Muppets, where Miss Piggy leads the rescue of the dashing hero Kermit. The 1988 BBC TV series, Maid Marian and the Merry Men, satirised the masculinity of the tradition further.
5 o'clock and all's well. 5 o'clock and all's well, except that Maid Marian has been kidnapped. The sheriff's up to no good. That dog is stealing the cheese. Kermit's mad at Piggy, and it's really only 4:30.
Another example of this change in context is when in 2013 Robin Hood was brought into the sci-fi sphere in the form of the Doctor Who episode Robert of Sherwood, showing our continued fascination with the historical figure.
Oh my god, it is, isn't it? Oh, you found him. You actually found Robin Hood.
That is not Robin Hood.
Well, then, who, sir, is about to relieve you of your next spot?
Overall, it can be argued that the representations of Robin Hood are indicative of the changing social-political landscapes of the time in which they appear. The yeoman, Robin Hood, of the late medieval period appears at a time of social upheaval following the Black Death and frequent periods of war and instability. Earl Robin can be attributed, at least in part, to the Tudor emphasis on gentrification and the repression of the destabilising effects of an unreformed Robin Hood tradition. The historical context of the Crusades and the reign of Prince John, that later becomes fixed in future retellings of the story, seem to resonate with the religious events of the early modern England under Queen Mary and Elizabeth. The character of Prince John could be argued to be a proxy for Richard III, the traditional villain of Tudor myth. In the modern day, the physical descriptions of the outlaw may be the same, but his significance is changing to remain relevant to the modern audience in the midst of a shifting social and political landscape.